Well, hello everyone. Good to see you all, no matter what time zone and country you're in. I hope you're all had a good week and good to see you all again. Welcome to the third session of the Community of Practice. And before we start again, I just want to say thanks to all of our co-sponsors. You can see all the uh, logos of all of the co-sponsors there, and many of you are members of those organizations. I just want to reiterate again what our key message is here, and that is that community is medicine. That throughout the long, long history of humans, it's been our ability to band together, to come together, that has always been key to responding to complex problems and solving them. And by working at the community level again, now we can do this for the climate ecosystem biodiversity catastrophe. So just continue to remember, always keep in mind in everything we do, and how does this affect that? If trauma can be passed down through generations, then so can healing and transformation and resilience. And this is our mission when it comes to the climate ecosystem biodiversity catastrophe that we face. Just to summarize last week, what we talked about was that to achieve that mission of passing down and building mental wellness and resilience for the climate emergency, we must help transform communities from being trauma organized to resilience enhancing. And the resilience coordinating networks, and whatever way you want to call that, are really the key to doing it. And the way you do that is you start by, to get those together, is you start by organizing a small planning group. And together they develop a mission statement and a vision of success and an elevator speech, sort of explaining it. That's their own vision of it. Then the initial group goes out and starts to share the elevator speech with others in the community, other people, organizations, and groups that might be interested, to try to continually expand the diversity and scope of the people involved. And then after a sufficient number of individuals and groups and organizations are involved, take the time to further clarify the mission statement. What are you trying to achieve? What's your vision of success? What would success look like in 5 years? And your operating principles, goals, objectives, et cetera. And establish a formal steering committee if you can. So today's agenda now is, after you've sort of begun to organize something like this, and I hope most of you have engaged in this in some way, trying to get some people together to start talking about forming a resilience coordinating network, how do you begin building community capacity for mental wellness and transformation resilience? And we're very honored to have two really outstanding presenters with us today, Matt Erb, who's the Associate Clinical Director with the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and Graham Parker, who's the Director of Systems Innovation and Policy at the Rural Opportunity Institute, will both share their work in very brief presentations with you. Before we get into and hear them, I just want to give some background, but let's first start with a resilience pause. And again, as we've done in the past, take a moment to use the skylight method, or whatever method you want to call it, to just sort of observe yourself and notice what's happening in your body, mind, and emotions now without trying to change anything. There's no right or wrong. Just sort of observe, sort of look down at yourself, say, what's going on? And just sort of pay attention to that for a second. And as you do that, this time we're going to practice a different presencing resilience skill, as we call them, called grounding, which is again developed by the Trauma Resource Institute. But there's many ways to do this, called this exercise. And it's really trying to pay attention to your body in the present moment. So if you would, find a comfortable position of any kind. You can be standing, you can be sitting, leaning against a wall, laying down. You can do this in any way. Find a comfortable position. And then bring all of your attention to the places in your body that are being supported by something solid. So it could be your legs and your buttocks and your back if you're sitting on a chair. If you're leaning against a wall, it could be your shoulder. If you're standing up, it could be the floor and your feet. Just put your attention to places in your body that are supported by something solid. And then bring your attention to that place and see what it feels like, and see if you feel any unpleasant, pleasant, or neutral sensations. Neutral meaning you don't feel anything, and that's fine. And if you feel something unpleasant, some pain, tension, whatever, heat, try to shift your attention to a place that feels pleasant, nice warmth, tingling, whatever, or neutral. And just sort of do that. Just sort of pay attention to where you're being supported by something solid and how that feels in your body. And then shift your attention to something pleasant or neutral. And then even as we start today's session, you might just want to keep your attention focused on parts of your body that feel pleasant or neutral, the areas that especially that are being supported by something solid. And then you always know you have that solid base. And again, the more you can focus on the pleasant and the neutral and deliberately do that and take your focus away from any negative feelings, the more you're likely to feel better. We'll come back to practice grounding a little bit more. But first, let's start with a 10-minute breakout room, just to say hello to everyone again. And Christian is going to post these instructions in chat for you, but just share one word how you feel right now. If you took a resilience pause daily or a couple of days a week during the week and practice resourcing, which is what we talked about last week, and then taught it to somebody else, how did that go? What was it like to try to practice a resilience pause regularly and practice resourcing and teach it? And if you assess the degree to which your community might be trauma organized versus resilience enhancing, what did you discover? And if you talk with others about forming a resilience coordinating network, excuse me, or expanding an existing one to address the climate ecosystem biodiversity catastrophe, what happened? What was the result? So just have that conversation for 10 minutes, and Jesse's going to divide you up now, and we'll see you back in about 10. Thank you.
Opening up the breakout rooms now.
Welcome back, everyone. I think everybody is back. If there's anything that your group, your breakout group talked about that you really think you want to share with others, please share that in chat. Key points, key questions. If you have questions, and Christian can sort of track that, and we can get it, talk about that when we get to the Q&A session later during the session. So hope you had a good breakout room and got to meet some new people. So let's just talk about again where we are now. Last week, we focused on how to get organized to form a resilience coordinating council network. And we didn't get time, but we sent out information about how to clarify the vision, values, operating principles. Mebin talked a little bit about that. And this week, today, we're going to talk about how you begin building community capacity, different ways to start this. How do you get communities engaged? You might have a core group that wants to get engaged, but maybe the community as a whole doesn't know anything about it. There's not enough interest in it, et cetera. So we're going to talk about that. And then starting next week, we'll start on on the 5 core areas that our research identified are going to be really critical for the climate emergency that these resilience coordinating networks need to focus on. The first one being build social connections across boundaries. That's what we're going to focus on next week. And then the last 2 sessions will focus on how do you continue to track progress, problem solve, learn, improve, et cetera, and building a long-term plan for success. So before we hear from Matt, who I hope is going to be joining us soon, let's just talk a little bit more about why we need to help communities begin to build capacity for mental wellness resilience in order to launch these long-term issues. Both chronic stresses and abrupt changes can be stressors for people. So let's do a stressor exercise. If you would, please add up the number of transitions small, tiny changes and large changes of any kind that you and your close family members experienced in the last 3 months. Just think about different things you had to do, changes you had to make in the last 3 months, and put that number in chat, if you would. Could have been related to work, could have been related to family members, could have been related to many other types of things. Just sort of how many transitions of any kind, small or large, did you have to make in the past 3 months? And you might not be precise, but just put that number in chat. And then think about if some of those transitions were stressful. And if so, how did you or your family members cope with that stress? What did you do? Just think about that for a second. Now think about how many more transitions of various kinds, small and large changes, occurred in your community or your neighborhood in the past 3 to 6 months, and how different residents likely coped with those stresses. So if you had 5 different transitions and you cope with it, sometimes you got a little angry, sometimes you got anxious, or other times you just dealt with it very, very well. How did the community, how many transitions like that likely happened in your community and youth? How do you think different kinds of different residents cope with it? Now select one of the transitions you identified and count the number of tasks, different things you had to do that you had to add to your responsibilities or alter from previous times, and put that number in chat. So how many tasks were associated with just one different transition that you had to make? And put that number in chat. And then think about, how did the additional or altered task affect you and your family? And how did you and your family cope with those tasks? Often a transition of any kind, a change of any kind, requires multiple tasks, so to speak, multiple additions to your responsibilities, multiple changes from the way you dealt with things in the past. How did that affect you and your family? And how did you cope with that? Now multiply the number of your tasks by the number of your transitions. So if you, on average, had to take 3 different tasks, you had 3 different changes you had to make based on the 10 transitions you had in the last 3 months, that's 30 different total changes and transitions. Imagine how many changes and transitions your community dealt with. So if you had to make 30, 40 different changes, small and large, how many different transitions and task changes did your community deal with? And now imagine the number of transitions and tasks that are going to be required as the climate and ecosystem biodiversity catastrophe accelerates, and the stresses that are going to result, and the type of coping mechanisms that people might use. Going to be pretty significant. And this is why we need to redefine mental health and psychosocial problems when it comes to the climate emergency. What appears to be mental health and psychosocial problems are usually, for most people, coping mechanisms, self-survival protective mechanisms that eventually go wrong. They made sense at the time. We had a couple glasses of wine or alcohol just to calm ourselves. That was how we started off, but then we sort of used it more and more and more, and then it went wrong. And when stresses and traumas are continuous or overwhelming, the mind often cannot distinguish between real and false threats. It just becomes overwhelming. Everything seems like a threat. And we consequently remain in a state of hyperinflated fear. This is very common. This is what humans do. And this can cause people to fail to consider healthy options and instead adopt coping mechanisms that end up harming themselves, harming other people, or harming the natural environment more. We buy more stuff. We become more consumption, et cetera. And the climate ecosystem biodiversity catastrophe is really the perfect storm, unfortunately. When cascading disruptions to the core systems people rely on for food, water, shelter, jobs, incomes, et cetera, get combined with these sort of blunt disasters that have we just experienced where I live 3 weeks ago, many others are experiencing. And when those impact individuals, families, groups, and organizations, the number of tasks and transitions required can create traumatic stresses that affect entire communities and societies and lead to maladaptive coping mechanisms. And one of the outcomes is what we talked about last week, and we'll continue to talk about. The result is trauma-organized communities. And I'm not going to go through all the specifics about that of these again, but people organize themselves to protect themselves from trauma and consequently usually repeat the very same kind of practices and behaviors, et cetera, that caused the problem in the first place. That's what trauma organized really means. We keep repeating and reusing the very similar kinds of practices, policies, interactions that created the problems in the first place as we try to work it out. We're trying to work it out, we just can't. And that really is what we're facing. And to address these struggles, we need to help residents begin to heal their trauma and start then building community-wide capacity for mental wellness and what we call transformational resilience. So that's really the starting point. Help people begin to heal, and then they go, oh yeah, we need to do this continually, and we need to do it at the community level. And one approach to do that, I saw that Matt came on, Matt Erb, is to engage residents in activities, in methods that help them learn information and skills that begin the healing process by helping them release their trauma. And so I want to introduce Matt Erb, who's the Associate Clinical Director for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. Matt, I know you're there. If you want to just, Jesse, I think should make you you can enable you to screen share now, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for all of the work you're doing in this area, and thank you to everyone here who is motivated in the same way that I am to very proactively contribute to this challenge that we're facing in climate change. I am located, and you can see in my background, this is a picture of the Tucson Mountains and the Sonoran Desert during monsoon season. So I'm in the Tucson area, but I have worked in various capacities for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine based out of Washington, D.C., which is an NGO serving population-wide trauma relief. And I'm going to put up my screen here and just get this into slideshow mode here. So hopefully, can you see that okay, Bob?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. I myself, I'm a physical therapist by background, and I specialize in the role of physical therapy and mental health. And I'm doing a lot of work in a variety of arenas, including with the Environmental Physiotherapy Association, to advance efforts to address this at multiple layers. Specific to what the Center for Mind-Body Medicine does is really framed as a public health approach to working with the reality of trauma in our lives. Both with individuals, but at the population-wide level. We use an evidence-based mind-body medicine skills training model that focuses on the development of self-referential processes, so self-awareness, and tools that support self-regulation. I often like to point out that self-regulation and much of self-care is framed as an individualistic construct, but if we look at the origins of the concept. It actually arose out of the racial rights movement in the 60s to support people's capacity for advocacy. And I think that's been co-opted by politics and organizations and sort of as a deflection of personal responsibility back onto the individual. And so we really recognize the model of serving ourselves is serving all others, serving others is serving ourselves. So it's a model of interdependence. And what we do to support that is a small group model. So we have published randomized controlled trials. I'll show you the statistics on those in just a minute. In children, adolescents, and adults around PTSD, but also anxiety, depression, and burnout in professionals, particularly in healthcare workers. But I've been advocating and working with other organizations to try to get a large-scale model that can be studied to see how this supports climate workers, climate advocates, and other layers of the population that support our climate. So basically, in our trainings, which I'll show you the model, we go in depth to the science of stress and trauma and in context to social determinants of health. So you see this phrase body, mind, and environment. It's not just individual body, mind, but it's that we're all bathed in social environments, built environments, natural environments, just layers of environment that carries profound influence. And that if we're experiencing ill health, it's not just an inside job, that the distribution of causality when people become ill or unwell is highly distributed, with a large percentage of it coming from these upstream conditions, the social determinants of health. And then what we do is we train people to go out and independently sustain and train others in their community. So giving communities back the power and the resources to do that. And I'll come back to this word, the ripple effect, in just a minute. That's just basically an overview of what CMBM does. And we actually work all over the world in a variety of settings with, of course, climate and natural disasters, which is what I'm here to talk with you about, is focused on. We have mobilized large-scale efforts in places like Houston after the hurricane and the massive flooding, in New Orleans after Katrina, Puerto Rico and Haiti after earthquakes and hurricanes, throughout Central and Northern California after wildfires, and so on. But we also go into places where there's been mass violence. So we do a lot of work around gun violence. One of our largest programs is in Broward, Florida, in the school district there after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shootings. And most recently, we're working in Uvalde, Texas. And this week, we're training 20 people in Lewiston, Maine, in our model as well, at a training that starts on Thursday. We also are working in Gaza and Israel, 20-year programs there, and most recently working with USAID, USAID, and PACT to train people in Ukraine. We've got 150 people trained on the ground in Ukraine as part of their public health system, and so on. You can see the rest of these. We do a lot of work in indigenous communities and partnering with indigenous populations. And I always point out when I talk about climate work, how important it is to utilize indigenous wisdom in communities wherever possible. And we do work with social justice. So we have grants from Kellogg Foundation to train social justice leaders in our work. So those are examples. This is a summary of some of our research, and if you want to scan this, and I can send Bob the slides if you want to print these out too, but that's just a link to all of our accumulated research over time. Most importantly, there's been an 80% or greater reduction in the number of people who qualify as having PTSD. So assessing whether they would qualify at the start of a mind-body group and at the end of a mind-body group. 72% of adolescents treated for depression. This is in the inner city of Indianapolis. This study was done using our model, reported that the experience had changed their lives. That doesn't necessarily mean complete resolution of the depression. And we really look at the concept of well-being as the cultivation of a more stable foundation, irrespective of the presence or absence of symptoms. So it's really like the art of living, the art of suffering, the art of joy, all in kind of in tandem. And you can read the rest of these, but there's other measures on burnout and anxiety, perceived stress scales, and so on. When we build a community project, what usually happens is disaster lands, and then we come in and tailor the project to the community's needs. What we're wanting to do more of, which is why I'm here and such a strong advocate for Bob's work and ITRC, is greater preparedness and community building in advance for the inevitable. That communities have a ready-made network to mobilize when new disaster lands. And basically, this is how it works. People come through 2 5-day trainings. Professional, that's the initial training, and the advanced. We then provide clinical supervision as people go out and lead workshops in small groups and deliver the work in their community. Certification is an advanced model that is available. And then we support leadership development and sustainability in the community. And all of this can be over a 2-year plus process. Our work in Houston, which really was quite a few years ago, is continuing to remobilize for community response into new traumas and disasters in the area, as one example. And this is that ripple effect. I just want to emphasize that each of you, when you pull a thread in the weave, eventually that'll unravel the whole thing. So we may feel frustrated or burnt out, but just remember that every little, it's like that little pebble in the pond, that every little effort that people work, including tending to your own health and well-being in the process of your advocacy work, really does make a difference. And sometimes we can't see that, but that's how we conceptualize it. And this is the link to our page specific to climate and disaster relief and my contact, and that's it. So Bob, I'll turn it back to you. And I know we're going to come back in a little bit to some questions and comments.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Good to hear you're up in Lewiston now. That those connections happen. So, great. Thank you very much. You're gonna have question and answer with Matt in a second. But first, want to just take a very brief, actually allow you to hear from a different approach. And this approach helps residents understand how trauma is activated and transmitted in their community. And with that, I want to introduce Graham Parker, who's the Director of Systems Innovation and Policy with the Rural Opportunity Institute. And after you hear from both of them, where they're going to have a time for question and answer. Graham, thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Let's do that. Put it in presentation. Same thing, Matt did. Put it in slideshow mode.
Got it.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot for having me. My name is Graham Palmer. I am, as Bob just said, the Director of Systems Innovation and Policy at Rural Opportunity Institute. So Rural Opportunity Institute, or ROI as we call it, is a small nonprofit that works in Eastern North Carolina. We work in about 3 counties that are in the most rural parts of the state, and also, as you'll see, some of the most challenging parts of the state. Quick background on myself. I spent 5 years in national security and international development consulting before coming to ROI. I really basically wanted something that was more connected to both my own country and more longer term hands-on work. And I found all of that at ROI. So I'm really grateful that I did. So for ROI, our mission is to support people, organizations, and communities to interrupt the cycle of generational trauma and design innovative solutions for healing and resilience. And everything that we do is guided by our North Star, which is to have the transmission of intergenerational trauma in the 25 most economically distressed counties in North Carolina. And all of those counties are rural. So that is going to give you a sense of the challenges that we're facing. But as you may intuit, a lot of the investment in our state and most states goes to more heavily populated areas. So we are focusing on the rural areas. This is some pictures of the work ROI does, and I'm about to get into the systems mapping process, which is the main point of this presentation in a second. But first, I'm just going to go through quickly a bit of the context that will help you understand what we do. So in our area, there is tons of resilience. There's tons of wisdom. Martin Luther King Jr. actually gave his "I Have a Dream" speech at our Rocky Mount, which is one of our main towns, before he gave it in Washington, D.C. But there's also huge challenges. So our child poverty rate in Edgecombe County, which is the main county where we work, is 33%, which is twice the national average. And less than 1% of children eligible for Medicaid in our area get it. And only 4% of schools in the Black Belt, which is a wider region in the Southeast with majority Black communities, have adequate funding. So that gives you a sense of the challenges that we're facing. But we're built on the premise that those stats and others like them are not the result of bad individual choices, but of systems that isolate and punish rather than heal, especially, unfortunately, when people need healing the most. And the way we know this is that our co-founders, Seth and Vici, proved this in 2017, because they spent a year doing empathy interviews with people and building a systems map. You can see some of the process that went into that on this slide, but essentially they started with existing connections. They both had done Teach for America in the area, so they had some connections in the school system especially. And then they went to those people's friends and their colleagues and their friends and colleagues. And eventually they, after a year, they had interviewed over 300 people and they made a map. So they collected these experiences and built the takeaways into loops. And you'll see here it's in progress. I'm about to show you the full thing. But basically what we see here are cycles, both vicious and virtual cycles, but we're focusing sort of on disrupting the vicious cycles. And this is the map that they came up with. And you'll see in the middle, the core story is the cycle of trauma. And essentially, that means people are being punished and isolated when they most need to be helped. And there's a vicious cycle. And to make that a little bit more concrete, I'm just going to go through an example. I know this may seem a bit abstract, or maybe everyone on this call probably actually knows a lot about trauma, but just to give you an example, let's talk about one mother named Christine, who Seth and Vici talked to. She has a college degree and she works in a healthcare facility, but she has a young son named William. And when William was little, Christine experienced domestic violence in her home. So she was forced to leave with William for their own safety. They were homeless during this period and lived out of their car for 2 months. And during this time, William started acting out in his pre-K class. The doctor diagnosed him with ADHD and put him on medication, but it turns out he didn't have ADHD because he was just reacting in the way that almost any 3-year-old would react in a stressful situation like that. So meanwhile, Christine was afraid to go to social services for support. She was worried they would file a report and then take William away from her. And she had good reason to worry that because she had friends and family and colleagues that had that experience. And we have that experience a lot in our community where people don't trust government systems for good reason. So she did her best to find work. Eventually, she found money for a house and she got an apartment and a steady nursing job. And so things started to get better. But William then got to first grade and teachers started sending him out of class and suspending him for his behavior. So to reduce the number of suspensions, Christine had to come in for a session. It turns out that session was held during the work week. She couldn't miss work. So her boss threatened to fire her if she missed any more days. So soon William was behind in school. He was even more stressed and anxious than when he was there. So that's a bit of an anecdote to give you a sense of this map and put a human face on it. But basically, both of them were stuck. The very systems that were supposed to help them were actually punishing them and making their situation worse and worse. And that's why we have these cycles. So Christine and William are not at all the only ones in this situation. Pretty much everyone that Seth and Vici talked to and everyone that I've since met in my 3 years working there has had a similar story like this. But it doesn't have to be this way. So Christine could have lived in a world where she could go to the police or social services after leaving her home with William. She could get access to stable housing. William could have lived in a world where his doctor had recognized that the source of his behavior was stress and not ADHD and prescribed self-regulating or stress-regulating practices instead of pills. His teachers could have had training and additional staff support to help him cope with his stress and to help them cope with their stress about dealing with kids in these situations. And then stay in class rather than being sent into a cycle of suspension and punishment and isolation. Christine's employer also could have created policies that would let her go to that hearing that was during work hours and advocate for her kids without losing her job. So those ideas aren't radical, they're not impossible, but they require our systems to see and understand people's experiences in a very different way. And that's where ROI comes in. So we believe that by seeding enough pockets of trauma-informed change within the different institutions in our communities, and you see some of them on this slide, we can accelerate a movement that's already been in motion to repair our rural institutions and rebuild trust with families and communities. This is what we're already seeing at ROI. So you can see here that we've reached 30,000 people with our various programming, and we've partnered with more than 20 organizations in our community to deliver interventions like biofeedback breathing. We've worked with the town of Tarboro to create a paid internship for high schoolers who need job experience. We've worked with an alternative school to provide mental health care in school and build Medicaid for that, so using existing resources. And we're always working on new interventions that are rooted in the community. And you can see on the right of this slide that we have these 3 green counties where we work, and then we have 2 blue counties where we have helped them build their own systems map and are hoping and working to help them build on this process as well. It's important to note we never work alone, so we believe in finding leverage by supporting existing institutions, and there's actually good research that supports this. It has been shown to be 15 times more effective in terms of lives impacted per dollar to work through existing leverage than to try to create new things. So that's what we do. And then this is the last thing I'll say, is that our foundation is our Community Accountability Board. You can see their faces here on the left. In my opinion, they're at least as probably more important than the faces on the right, which is our full-time team. They're drawn from our community, and I would note that importantly, most of them are from that systems mapping process, which in addition to building the systems map, built a lot of trust and connection. And so those 10 people you see there are all from our community. They're including pastors, workers in the school system, social workers, and community organizers who know the community best. And we have them have decision-making and prioritization power over what we do. And we feel that's really important in terms of making sure our work is rooted in the map and the trauma that we're trying to address, and the community, most importantly. So I'll end it there and just invite you to join our movement if you want to learn more. I also have a QR code just like Matt. You can scan this to book a call, and my email is also there in the slide in case you're interested in emailing me, and of course, happy to take any questions. So thank you all.
Thank you, Matt, very much. Really appreciate it. Why don't you take your slides down just for a second? There we go. And let's just, for 1 second, we're going to do a question and answer here, but just for 1 second, just take a resilience pause. Just practice the skylight method, and then you might want to practice grounding for a second. Just feel where your body is supported by something solid. Feel the pleasant or neutral sensations there. Just take a second to calm yourself in order to help yourself think clearly. And then let's just have a question and answer with Matt and Graham. If you could post some questions in chat, Christian will read those, and we can go from there. I want to start with a question first for both of you, but what specifics, Matt, what specific skills does the Center for Mind-Body Medicine teach people, just as an example, those resilient skills? And for Graham, how did your there's Rural Opportunity Institute get people to engage in systems mapping? So both of those questions, in either one, you can go first.
Sure, I can jump in, and we've chosen a select number of skills that are evidence-based from the broad field of mind-body medicine. So mindfulness, contemplative movement practices, biofeedback, guided imagery. We do a body-centered approach to genogram work, which looks at historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. And let's see, what are some others? We do body awareness training. A lot of our skills are translated, I'm going to use a big fancy phrase, but from a phenomenological perspective. So they're actually designed to be
okay, I have bad news. Pretty bad.
Could somebody put the, yeah, there we go.
I got you. Sorry about that.
That's right. They're designed in a particular way that they have this unique ability in an unforced way to access the lived experience of people, that inner realm. So it's not just like, you know, telling people what to do, but it's very person-centered and phenomenologically oriented. So it's an exploration of lived experience. So there's a whole broad set of them, but they're tailored in a very unique way that offers this opportunity for process-based work with individuals and communities.
Thank you.
And then on my end, I would say, so a few keys to that we use to get people to engage. First of all, Seth and Vici already had strong relationships in the community due to their Teach for America years. So they were not strangers. I would say, second of all, it's good that we're a rural community in some ways because people know each other and we have a quite tight-knit community. So it's kind of snowballed. Once they interviewed, I wasn't actually there, so I don't know the numbers, but you know, once they interviewed a few dozen, people just were like, oh, you should talk to my friend, you should talk to my colleague. And that happened. And that snowballed not only to, you know, 300 plus people, but also to leaders. So they interviewed superintendent, the county manager, town manager, the mayor, town council. Those are all people we have strong relationships with. So that's really helpful. And I'd say tactically, it's all about, may not be a surprise or a revelation, but it's all about coming to it with a sense of humility and just listening. And we used human-centered design principles in terms to actually create the interviews. So a lot of times, instead of saying, or you can ask, you know, what are the biggest challenges in your life, but you also want to ask, tell me about the last time you had a challenge. Tell me about the last time you had trouble getting to work on time or something like that. So people start remembering specific things, and then they usually flow from there. It's not, nobody really has a lack of things to talk about. It may just be a barrier to getting started. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Christian, you want to read some other questions?
Yes, alrighty. So I have one for Graham here. Excuse me. Have you worked on change at the state level? For example, the Department of Education with trauma-informed training for schools, or embedding trauma-informed content into ECU education degrees?
Yeah, so very timely question for us. So we haven't worked too much at the state level yet, but we are working on it now. And I think in some really exciting ways. So the reason we haven't done it that much yet is because we really believe in this local, place-based, highly connected approach. But there are definitely some lessons that we've learned that we want to spread statewide. And so we actually, for one big win, we just got over $300,000 worth of grants to do trauma-informed work in schools. And that was a district by district thing, so it wasn't state level, but the funding is coming from the State Department of Public Instruction. And so we're going to be able to get trauma-informed training into a lot more schools through that. So we basically helped the individual districts across the state, like we just emailed all of them and helped them apply for these grants that were available from the state. So that was big. And we are in longer term discussions with the state about maybe requiring trauma-informed instruction for all public employees. I mean, that would be like the dream probably years from now, but taking steps towards that. And then another big thing I'm working on with the juvenile justice system at the state level is shifting access to resources like mental health resources and housing supports like that before students become involved in juvenile justice, because there's some funds available now where families can get help for their kids, but they feel they have to charge their kid with a crime or misdemeanor in order to get them in the juvenile justice system, in order to get them help, which, as you can imagine, creates all kinds of trauma and issues. And the juvenile justice system people also think this is a problem, but they're trying to find a balance between also having resources for people that are in the system. So we've been working with them, and you know, I actually have a meeting next week on that, so it's ongoing. But I'd say those are that we're starting to make some progress at the state level. And not much in content into education degrees. We do work with the community colleges, but I think that's a great idea for us to pursue as well.
Thank you. Christian, there's another question.
Yes, here's for Matt. Can you speak to group size and how you reach communities to engage them?
The small groups, both in our training and in the way that they're delivered in the community. For example, all the groups that are being led across Ukraine typically are 8 to 10 people per small group. How we reach communities to engage them. A lot of people come to us. We've trained 8,000 professionals across the world. And many of them, when there's a need in their community, reach out and connect us with local partners and funding agencies to bring the model into the community. So a lot of it is people who are familiar with us, but we're also very proactive. So when a situation lands in a particular region, we often, our development team, Dr. Jim Gordon, the founder of the center, still very active in his work in his 80s now. He and our development team will just start reaching out and saying, this is what we have to offer. If there's any openings, let us know. Even the Lewiston, Bob reached out after the Lewiston Maine shootings and connected me to someone up there. And at the same time, we had 2 faculty members who had connections there, and they went and started volunteering, and then that led to someone was able to acquire the funding to get around 15 to 20 people through our next training to get them on the track to do it. So lots of different avenues for how people come into the work.
Thank you. Just a quick addition there. So somebody who had been through last year's community practice contacted me after the shootings in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine, and then I connected them with Matt, and that's how that evolved. So it really helped. Christian, another question.
Alrighty, this one's for Graham. Do you get any pushback or resistance from groups like teachers or healthcare professionals who are overworked or under-resourced in their own right about having more responsibility asked of them? And if yes, how do you combat that?
So the sort of like surface level answer is no. Nobody ever says we don't want to do this because we are overworked. At least that's never happened to me. But what does happen is people won't respond to you because they are overworked. And so we have had to develop something we call, this is not my term, but I really like the term administrative advocacy. And it's basically just a fancy word for following up with people many times. And so, for example, we did trauma-informed training with the school resource officers in our community, which is, as you probably know, the school security officers. They have a lot of influence over the course of a child's life. And we felt that was really important. And the sheriff was on board in terms of saying the right things. It's just that they wouldn't respond to our emails on scheduling for a long time. And I don't think that they're actively resisting. It's more like the overwork thing that you pointed out, Karina. So I would say the way we overcome that is A, just following up a lot, but B, trying to sort of make it clear what's in it for them. So with the sheriff, he's a public official. We co-published a report with him on trauma-informed school security to get him some good publicity and get him more bought in. And I wouldn't say it's perfect. I mean, it's still a little bit hard to get them on the phone, but we did get all the SROs trained. And then number 2 is just sort of, the trainings themselves that we conduct. We try to, it can be up to 2 days, but it's usually a bit shorter than that. And we don't frame it as a burden, frame it as tools that are really going to help in the future. So if that makes sense, it's mostly not explicit pushback, but more just people not responding. And that's how we've worked on that. And if you have any better ideas, let me know, because that's a big challenge we face.
Thank you. Time for one more question. Christian.
Excellent. Here's one for Matt. Can you speak to the importance of multiple people in the community being trained together? And similar to maybe our last question, what is a good sized cohort in this community?
It depends upon the funding and grant size as to how many can be trained in terms of the budget and the time it takes. Our training's pretty intensive. We work together with the local partners on participant selection and always aim for as big of a cross section of the community structure and as is possible. In some cases, like our work in the state of Nevada, funded by the Andre Agassi Foundation, that's dedicated exclusively to the needs of teachers and schools. So the selection comes, you have to work in education to be able to access that. So it varies based on the community, the program, the funding size. And I did see the other question. I'll just quickly say, for the person probably in California with the wildfires, a lot of things dissolved during COVID, unfortunately. We have found vastly different sustainability based on the unique setup of that community. Our example in Houston is that we had a local partner through one of the universities there. It's called the Institute for Spirituality and Health, and they embedded our model into their own training, and they have their own sustainable version of it. So when there's a local partner that has longevity that takes it on, they become the central hub to continue to spread it. That hasn't happened, unfortunately, in some communities. But right now, our new COO is working deliberately to go back to every community we've worked on to see where things are at, what the needs are, and if we can partner on grant writing to support further sustainability.
Thank you both very much. You're both doing just excellent, outstanding work, and really provide models that others can begin to think about. So thank you again for joining us. If you can both send your slides to me and Jesse, or if you don't have Jesse's email, just send them to me and we'll post them on the Climate Forum site. And we'll also be able to connect you with to both Matt and Graham if you have other questions, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much again, both of you, and we wish you all the best on your wonderful, exciting work and much needed work.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Let's now take a 10-minute breakout room where you get a chance to talk about what you just learned and heard from Matt and Graham. So share what you learned, discuss if and how you can implement one of these approaches possibly, or variations of them in your neighborhood or your community, and identify some key questions. Let's just get a chance to talk about what you've just heard. So Jesse will break you out into breakout rooms, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Opening the rooms now.
Thank you again, Matt and Graham. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good conversations. If you have key points, key questions, key concerns that came out of the discussion, can you post those in chat? And we'll try to get to those in a few moments. So just post all of that there if you can. Anything that stood out, just post those issues in chat and we'll try to get to those. I want to just very briefly, with the time we have left, talk about a couple of the different approaches. So, but just to reiterate, somebody's got not on mute there. So first, one way to start getting a community engaged with a community resilience initiative is to begin to help people heal by bringing in an organization like Center for Mind Body Medicine. Once people start learning these skills, you can build towards this much broader ongoing resilience coordinating network. Another approach is, as you just heard, is to help people understand how trauma is expanded and reinforced in the community by doing that kind of systems mapping. We didn't get a chance to actually see it. But you build from there into an ongoing approach. Still another approach, just a simpler approach, if your community is not seriously traumatized, is to start with a conference on trauma and resilience-informed approaches. You can bring in a good speaker and they can provide a vision for the community about how they can prevent and heal traumas and engage people in a few exercises. A good example is the rural community of the Dalles, Oregon, which no one would have ever thought would have engaged in these issues. They saw a lot of trauma in their school districts, and they brought in Dr. Sandy Bloom, who many of you know, and helped form the Center for the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. She gave a great presentation, as Sandy always does, and it engaged them, and they formed a steering committee, and they actually engaged in all this kind of work. So that's another approach. And still another one, which is really very powerful, but usually you can't do this until community members are somewhat regulated, if you will, self-regulated, is to do asset mapping. And I want to just go into that in some depth here for a second. So after residents begin to heal through practice through engagement in activities like the offered by the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. And there's a couple of other organizations that do this kind of work. You'll hear from them down the road in the community of practice. Or they're not seriously traumatized, you can begin to really engage them in a process called asset mapping. And that assets are protective factors that residents believe they can use to address their concerns and enhance mental wellness and resilience. Asset mapping means engaging residents through a strength-based wellness and resilience lens that helps them see the resources that already exist and then imagine and try to create new resources to prevent and heal psychological, social, emotional, and behavioral issues. It's usually best once you have a resilience coordinating network organized of some kind, you'll have your initial vision statement and goals, et cetera. But before you finalize them, it's usually best to do the asset mapping then, because as you engage residents in this process, you're going to get important information that'll shine the light on what your goals, what your network's objectives and strategies will be. It'll just help improve them. And what asset mapping is, here's a good example. Once communities identify and map their strengths and their resources, they can more easily think about how to use them, how to use those assets, and how to establish additional ones that address the immediate concerns seen in the community to build mental wellness and resilience and prevent future ones. And identifying and building on assets is just, the research is pretty unequivocal, is far more impactful, far more beneficial than what we commonly do is try to go in and assess and try to fix deficits or eliminate risks. Once you go down that path, those risks are there, those deficits are there, but you can often just go on forever. When you start to identify assets or protective factors, they often can address 2 or 3 of those risks or deficits all at once. So the basic steps in asset mapping are, first, you clarify the geographic boundaries. What community or what neighborhood exactly, naming the roads, if you will, that form the boundary. What are we going to map? In what boundary are we going to map those assets? Then you engage residents in identifying their key concerns and other things and relate them then to their individual and collective issues and wellness and resilience. So you talk about what do you want to talk about? What are the issues you want to focus on? How do they make you feel in terms of your capacity for wellness and resilience? Then you engage them in mapping the protective factors, those assets that they believe can help strengthen their capacity for wellness and resilience. And after those maps are completed, engage residents in discussing how they can strengthen and expand create other assets of both how they strengthen and expand existing assets and form new ones to enhance their capacity for mental wellness resilience. And then you identify paths forward. How do we do that? And you engage residents in there. So here is a sample community asset map. So you identify institutions. It's not every institution, schools, universities, hospitals, libraries, special agencies, you can see that, et cetera. Not many residents will say not all of those are assets. Some of them actually re-traumatize us, as you just heard from Graham and others. So you want to really help them hear from the residents, what are the assets that actually help enhance wellness and resilience in the community, but also individuals, people with specific skills, knowledge, specific gifts, youth, older adults, artists, et cetera. Physical spaces in the community, parks, gardens, playgrounds, hiking trails, et cetera. Aspects of the local economy that help people, might be for-profit businesses, it could be banks, it could be foundations, it could be other things. Down back on the other side, all sorts of associations, organizations of various kinds, charitable groups, cultural groups, civic groups, elderly groups. And then down on the right side, stories. You also want to have, when you get to this, ask people to identify narratives, stories that exist in their community that help maintain mental wellness and resilience. Once you identify all those, you actually go and map them on a map, put them on the street. Where are they? What road are they on? And what neighborhood are they on? And then you can also see, oh, well, there's nothing over in this neighborhood to the northeast of us. And all the good religious or spiritual organizations, they're over there near the freeway, and there's not any over here, whatever it might be. And then that's what can engage residents in discussions about, here's what we have, how can they be strengthened, and how do we add new ones? Different kinds, the same kind, but in a different location. And it really can be a very powerful process. I've used this a number of times and found it's time consuming, it's exhausting for the facilitators especially, but it's very powerful. And from that information, you can then develop a community resilience portrait, whatever you want to call it. So, you can take that information, you put it into a report, if you will, saying, here's what we have in our community, and you can distribute it widely. And you also can have those maps put out widely to people all over the community on the internet. You can put posters of them, and you have them at the YMCA and many other places where people can just keep looking at it and read what it says. But it's not necessarily important to write a written document, because what's even more important is to use that process to build social connections that are vital for the climate emergency, that people get to know each other and work it and say, oh, I didn't know that you are over in that community or that neighborhood doing that kind of work. That's great. And I didn't know you actually are involved with this particular asset, a religious organization or a civic group or whatever. It really builds them. And my experience, and I think if you look at the research on this, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to asset mapping. Each community's got to develop a method. You look at the research, talk to people who've done it ahead of time, and then develop a method that really fits your local demographics, the culture, and the resources available. Many times people can't do it during the day, so you have to do it on a weekend or in the evening, and so you do short periods of time. You have to really adjust it for your process, but it's very powerful. So let's post some questions. We don't have a lot of time, but let's just post questions about what you just talked about and that may have come out of your discussions in your chat rooms just for a few minutes, and we'll take questions very quickly. If Christian, can you read a couple of questions?
Looks like they're still on their way in, folks. Feel free to post your questions in the chat here.
One question we often get about asset mapping is, how do you actually get people to show up to those kind of processes? And the way we did it in one community I helped, we started with a local group, an organization, and did just a 2-hour asset mapping process. They got it. They understood what it was and the benefits, and they started to go out and talk to other people and say, this could really benefit us. And then we held a half-day workshop doing it. So that's one way to engage. Start small, get some folks who understand what the process is and go out and do that. But it's the same with systems mapping that you heard from the Rural Opportunity Institute folks, that's how you can really start systems mapping too.
So Bob, speaking to getting this process started, what is the ideal area size for asset mapping? Could it be a neighborhood, a town, etc.?
That's a great question. Thank you for whoever asked that. And the answer is all of the above. That is to say, it's really up to the group. And they have to define the geographic fit, but that's why you have to have a discussion about that. And often you want to start smaller and then expand. Once people get it, understand what they're doing, then you can expand it. So probably a neighborhood or 2 neighborhoods, but not large areas, makes sense, especially in an urban area. But if you're working in a rural community, you might start with the whole community, but define it. So does that community include just the geographic area, or does it include some rural areas where people might live and commute back and forth? They have to just take the time to think that through. And often what happens is you take a step, you do it, and then people want to expand it after that. But it's up to the community, the group, to do that.
So how much time do you generally see asset mapping taking? You said 2 hours. Is that typical?
It really depends. Some variation of asset mapping can go on for 6 months or more if people engage. So you start off with a small 1 hour, 2 hour thing to get some people, a small group to understand it. Then you might expand with more people, you do more and you find more assets that people never thought about, and more ways to add and strengthen additional assets that people didn't think about it. And then that just might continue, but in different forms. Different organizations, different entities might pursue this on their own in different ways. So there's no time limit. But again, start small, see how it goes, improve. You'll need to improve as a facilitator, and then expand slowly. One more question. You're on mute.
Are there any specific tools, online or otherwise, to reference or to help focus on asset mapping project?
Yeah, just Google asset mapping, but the DePaul Institute, ABCD Institute, is one of the best ones that has that. But if you just Google asset mapping, community-based asset mapping, I think you'll find lots of it. But we'll provide some information on that also. So, okay, so just a summary of what we've talked about today. There's a number of ways to help residents begin to heal their trauma. You've heard from 2 different ways. There's a number of ways. And you have to choose one that matches the need and the culture and the resources available in your community. So think that through. But whatever approach is used, it should be used as a catalyst to engage residents in longer term efforts to operate and organize some type of resilience coordinating network to build population level capacity for mental wellness and resilience, given the stresses and the disasters and emergencies speeding our way with the climate emergency. So yes, you do want to help people heal their trauma from whatever it might be that they're experiencing now, but use that as a way to build a long-term initiative. And engaging residents and trying to identify and utilize the existing strengths and resources and adding additional ones is going to be far more powerful and effective over the long term than trying to identify and eliminate risks or fix deficits. So just keep that in mind. So with that, in closing, just we're going to post, Christian's posting now, or already has, an evaluation. We'd like to hear from you about how you think the first 3 sessions of the community practice have gone. It's short, shouldn't take you more than 2 or 3 minutes to complete. If you could do that, we'll also post it on the Climate Forum site. So we'd like to hear from you. Or just almost a third, not quite a third of the way done. We just want to hear how it's going for you. Also, if you can just very quickly post in chat, are you going to attend this Thursday special session? You can just put yes or no, we'll attend. It's going to be this Thursday, February 29th from 12 to noon, just an hour Eastern time. And it's a chance for people specifically in the social service field to talk, meet each other. We don't have that much time here except a couple of breakout rooms. But also, if desired, we can discuss how to talk about the climate catastrophe and what phrases and terms to use for mental wellness and resilience with local residents. So that can be one of the topics. And your homework is please take a resilience pause daily, and this time practice grounding and teach it to someone else if you can. Teach it to your child or a friend or your spouse, whatever, and see how that goes. But also then share what you learned today. We hope that you've reached out to a couple other people about forming a new resilience coordinating network or helping an existing one expand their work. Speak with them about what you just heard today and decide if you can use one of the methods you just heard about to help residents begin to heal their trauma and to use that to start building community capacity for mental wellness resilience. And if you think you can do that, when do you want to do it? When will that occur? When will you actually make that happen? And then we'll get together a week from today, March 5th, and we'll dive into the very first foundational focus that's really vital, building social connections across boundaries in the community. So with that, all of this will again be posted on the Climate Forum website, and we wish you all a very good week. And look forward to hearing from you during the week on the website, and we'll see you a week from now, or hopefully see a lot of you on Thursday. Thank you. Take care, everybody.